Okay, well, hello, Christopher Marquis and Phil White. Welcome to the This View of Life podcast. So happy to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having us, David.
This podcast is on the B Corp movement, and you two are authorities. Chris, you are Senior Professor of Chinese Management at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School. Adam Grant has described you as one of the world's leading experts on the dynamics of business and social innovation. You literally wrote the book on B Corps, at least one of them, titled Better Business, How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism, published in 2020. And your newest book is titled The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. It will be out on May 14th, and in many ways describes conventional business as the evil twin of the B Corp movement. So is there anything you'd like to add to my introduction?
No, that's great. Evil twin. I'll use that in the future.
And we'll be talking more about that. And Phil, you are co-founder and CEO of Grounded, which is a B Corp, and which you describe as a social innovation and brand activation agency working with brands, retailers, startups, and nonprofits all over the world to help them articulate their purpose, activate their brands, and accelerate their impact. So you know about B Corp, the B Corp movement from the inside, both your own business and the other B Corps with which you work. So what awesome talent we have here to talk about the B Corp movement. Is there anything, Phil, you'd like to add to my introduction?
Captures it for me.
Okay,
Thanks,
good.
David.
Okay. So the B Corp movement is not new, but this podcast is new by viewing the movement through the lens of a new paradigm for economics and business. And I need to do just a little bit more stage setting in order to, for us to get started. The concept of paradigm is so interesting. We use the word too much because it really does have an important meaning, which is an interlocking set of ideas that makes sense of the world in some respects, but also has difficulty escaping its own assumptions. And for nearly a century, as you well know, the dominant paradigm in economics and business has been the neoclassical paradigm, fondly referred to as Homo economicus. And when we view the B Corp movement against the background of the neoclassical paradigm, it's really weird. I mean, it's just like nothing that you learn in business school. It seems like the exact opposite of Milton Friedman's shareholder value model. And no matter how well you describe it, and no matter how well you document its success, it will always be at the periphery, at the margins of the neoclassical paradigm, never at the center. So thankfully, a new paradigm is emerging based on a combination of complex system science and evolutionary science, which Dennis Snower and I call the multi-level paradigm in a series of articles that we've written titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Economics. And like the neoclassical paradigm, the multi-level paradigm provides its own integrative framework. Here's what we write about it. The multi-level paradigm, like the neoclassical paradigm, provides an integrative framework for macro and microeconomics. It also incorporates the mesoscale, comprising groups of various sizes, linking micro and macro. In the integrative framework of the multi-level paradigm, many important ideas that are currently on the periphery of economics are brought towards the core. And that's the whole point, that what the new paradigm can do for the B Corp movement, and what I hope to convey in this podcast, is that when we view the B Corp movement through the lens of the new paradigm, it makes perfect sense. It is an exemplar of the new paradigm, and all corporations should structure themselves along similar line. And conversely, when the shareholder value model is viewed through the lens of the new paradigm, it can be clearly seen as pathological. So what was peripheral becomes central, and what central becomes peripheral. Viewing the facts through the lens of the new paradigm makes all the difference. Okay, now, maybe I should just take a breath here and let you comment briefly on that, and then we'll launch into it. So any and all observations, including none, but a few thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I would agree with you that, I think that the B Corp movement is focused very much on changing the paradigm. It's not necessarily about accumulating a large number of B Corps, although that, the number grows. There's 8,000 now. There's millions of businesses globally, so a very, very small amount.
A large number, but a tiny fraction.
Right. Yeah. Very, very small fraction. And I think that there will always be a very small fraction because it's a rigorous certification. It's a certification that companies have to, they have to do a lot just even to go through the process, let alone actually how they structure their business, the practices they have. But my sense of the goals of the movement and what I write about in the 2020 book that you kindly mentioned, David, is that, really it's about creating, tools, processes to shift the paradigm from something where, there is a primary focus on shareholders to one that, where business is much more embedded within, societies and communities and focuses on the environment. So I think, the focus on sort of shifting paradigms is a good one to start off this discussion.
Yeah, and I think that what we're adding, if anything, has to do with, you might call, the intellectual and the theoretical high ground. Because on the one hand, these businesses take place in the real world. They really have to survive in the real world. But then there's this kind of overarching way of looking at things, the high ground, which is, wouldn't it be nice if that theoretical high ground was favorable rather than unfavorable towards the paradigm? Sure. Phil, how about you?
Yeah, it's interesting and kind of building on what Chris was saying, that I guess being a B Corp and being involved with B Corps and consulting to B Corps every day, it doesn't feel much like a new paradigm to me. It feels like
that's a good thing.
Very much the way that the world should be. Sure. And, I know when the B Corp movement first started getting going, I think, Chris, if I'm correct, early 80s, was it? Maybe a little bit earlier? I can't remember now exactly.
Oh, no. So I think B Lab was founded in 2006. So it's
2006.
Pretty recent.
Okay.
Very recent, yeah.
So there's definitely been a groundswell of intention around how to operate better businesses. And I think particularly now as we see this quickening of, social, technological and political dysfunction, for want of a better word, and people and consumers, going through, a kind of level of existential crisis around why the world seems to be spinning out of control in the way that it is. When you come back to the fundamental domains that I know that Dennis Snow was just talking about yesterday, business is right at the center of it, because of course that's what drives economics, which in turn enables politics and society and culture to operate. So kind of when you strip away all the layers, it is imperative that business operates in a socially responsible way for the benefit of all stakeholders. And in fact, I would argue that's probably how business has always been. It's just that we've allowed the forces of modern economics and Homo economicus to run riot and take ownership of what really should be a platform for the benefit of all. So I think that's kind of my take on it all, really.
Yeah, and I think that what you say about it not seeming paradigmatic when you're actually doing it is a great point to make, because I think every paradigm results in a common sense and just the way things should be. And so when you're operating within the paradigm, it just seems that you're just doing what comes naturally. And your other point about the businesses actually were more like this in the past. There was a time when businesses thought that they should be responsible citizens in some kind of larger ecosystem, and they succeeded on the basis of their reputation. So simple. Mm-hmm. I mean, the way so many groups work, the difference between power versus prestige based on reputation. Chris, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that, I think for many people, it just seems so natural. Oh, you have this situation where we should be, just sort of very myopically focused on shareholders. And then this seems very like different or controversial perhaps, but actually that period of time, be it 50, 60 or 100 years, whatever it is, I think I agree 100% with both of you. That's the aberration. And, that I think is, I think that's a position that we should be sort of helping people understand more.
Yeah, so what the new paradigm tells us is that all cooperative endeavors need two things. One concerns governance, they must be well governed, and the other concerns adaptability. They must be capable of changing in a mindful fashion. And the governance part is based largely on a set of core design principles that the political scientist Elinor Ostrom derived for a certain kind of group, groups that are attempting to manage their common pool of resources. And I know that Ostrom is well known to both of you. And these principles can be generalized to include all cooperative endeavors. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, fly by these core design principles and then take a second pass just to see how much sense they make of the B Corp movement, of a B Corp. So what Ostrom showed, and what can be generalized, is here are 8 things that all groups need. Number 1, a clear sense of identity and purpose. You have to know that it's a group. It has to be a meaningful group. You need to know what's in it. You need to know what it's about. Number 2, equitable distribution of benefits and resources. What you get from the group must be proportional to what you give from the group. 3, inclusive decision making. Decision making must include everyone in the decision making process. Number 4, and this one's going to be huge, is transparency of behavior. We need to know that we're doing what we're supposed to do. Monitoring what we do, transparency of behavior. I think that's one thing that B Corp does exceptionally well because of that whole certification process that you were describing, Chris, and that we'll be returning to. Number 5, graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behavior. If you're not doing what you should, then there has to be some correction for it. Need not be nasty, but it does need to escalate in some cases. And at the same time, we need to reward what works in addition to altering and correcting what doesn't work. There must be positive reinforcement in addition to negative. Number 6, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur. They need to be resolved quickly as possible, and in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. Number 7, autonomy and authority to implement these core design principles, the ability to self-govern, basically. And then number 8, this is also going to be huge for B Corps, appropriate relations with other groups. And we must look at the between-group relations in addition to within-group relations, and they embody the same principles. So that means that the principles are scale independent. What's needed for good governance within groups is also needed for good governance between groups, and that's sometimes known as polycentric governance. And so we need to look at the B Corp movement in a multi-group ecosystemic sense, and of course that's exactly what they do. So when I look at the B Corp movement through that lens, I see that that those core design principles provide a portrait of a B Corp, is the way I would think of it. And you can please feel free to disagree. But let's maybe pass through these again. We don't have to go through each and every one. But or maybe you should just give your impressions. Is this not like a pretty accurate description of what the way a B Corp functions?
Yeah, I would say, well, to me, and I'll let Phil comment more on this specific, like your question asking about B Corp, but I think that, the movement in and of itself is a bigger entity than just even the sum of the of B Corps, themselves. And so I think that these principles really very much fit the movement overall, certainly. And that's why, in the title of my book, I call it the B Corp movement, because it's actually, fits very well. Even this, first principle, it's a group that has an identity and has a shared sense of purpose. And it's not just entrepreneurs running businesses. It's, legal scholars working on policy changes. It's academics like myself that are writing and researching. It's, large companies and leaders. It's people in the capital markets. So it is a cross-cutting, group that cross-cuts many different types of maybe professional or sector-oriented groups with a generally a common shared purpose. So I think, I think the movement generally fits these principles.
How would you describe CDP1, the sense of identity for the whole movement? What would be your summary description?
Well, I mean, I think that not to rely too much on on B Lab's marketing copy, so to speak, but this business as a force for good is sort of their tagline, and I think is something that fits because you have there's been a number of sort of corporate governance, legal innovations that now not just the United States, but in a number of countries in Europe and Latin America have and even Africa, Rwanda just recently implemented this change. So that's also fitting, sort of governance and corporate form that's focused on sort of business for good, expanded purpose. So I think
So let's emphasize that in order to implement some of these design principles, especially broadly, requires legal changes. It's not not always something that a business can just decide to do, especially when it comes time to being acquired by other businesses. And so one of the major objectives of the B Corp movement is to actually create a legal social environment that's more favorable to its principles, and I would say its principles map quite closely onto the core design principles, is one of its major objectives, and one that it's been very successful at.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this relates to your opening around paradigm shift. I mean, it's that requires, a number of, sectoral type of changes if we're going to actually change how sort of people are sort of thinking and conceiving of the way to do business.
And I think that when we say business as a force for good, what that's saying is basically we take responsibility for our externalities. And so we don't do harm anywhere up the line. If what we're doing is harmful systemically, then we don't do that. We take responsibility for our actions would be a way to. So that makes it pro-social, not just internally, but pro-social at the largest scale, all the way up to the planet is the way I would put it. Is that about right?
Yeah.
So Phil, how does this look like from the perspective of a single company such as yours or the B Corps that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, this is all pretty philosophical, isn't it? So if you kind of strip it away,
drag us down from the clouds. Drag us down from the clouds.
What's going on here? I mean, it really talks. I think the B Corp really talks to the kind of existential challenge of the individual. The battle between, if you like, the ego and the self, or individual self-interest rather than kind of altruism and overall group benefit, and that thematic pulses right the way through the B Corp movement. The biggest challenges that B Corps face, and will always face, is the balancing of purpose and profit, let's say, or the balancing of being able to represent what's true and good and equitable for everyone involved, as well as being able to commercialize their operations and continue to operate, generate a profit, in order to enable that company to exist and hopefully in order to help kind of grow the movement as well. So there's an inherent tension going on all of the time within this dynamic and within these kind of core design principles about how do you behave for the benefit of all stakeholders in a collaborative, cooperative, and ultimately altruistic and generative way, while simultaneously still being able to kind of manage and drive the levers of commerce and demand in order to generate the income in order for that organization to survive and progress. So the core design principles are really a way, a governance framework as I see it, for the B Corp movement to kind of figure out what are the kind of dials and levers from a governance point of view that can be undertaken to try and stay on the track and try and stay in this kind of sense of balance. But I think any B Corp leader will tell you that it is a constant balancing act, and it's a constant tension, and it's a constant preoccupation to figure out how you can continue to provide benefit to all stakeholders, including the earth and the planet and society and culture as a whole, and of course your own team and your employees, as well as being able to successfully navigate the commercial drivers of profit.
Especially in a business world that's stacked against you, basically, because the business world is configured mostly according to the neoclassical paradigm.
Exactly. So these two paradigms are running concurrently, colliding with each other all of the time. And I think I think it was a Harvard Business School article always sticks in my head, is they were looking at some of the qualities of successful leaders, and I think one of the top performing qualities was the ability to hold opposing concepts in your mind at the same time and navigate through the space in between. And I think that's exactly what the B Corp movement demands. It demands that you're able to not only hold them, but also navigate and practically manage them to enable to kind of navigate your business through to a better place. So yeah, it's no mean feat, but I think having that constant tension, really going back to the core design principles, it really does force you into being more approachable, more aware, more considerate, more inclusive, more equitable. And you come to realize that you can't do it by yourself. You need a community around you in order to succeed. Yeah. So when you kind of strip it away, into your initial point, David, you look at the core design principles, whether intentionally or not, I would say these core design principles are very much embedded in the kind of B Corp psychology and how the movement is growing.
Yeah, well, I think that this is something else that's very general, and this goes to the very root of my contribution to this as an evolutionary biologist, asking the question, when does altruism and all other forms of prosociality evolve in a Darwinian world? When does giving actually end up contributing to survival and reproduction? And what we find is that in any kind of group, if you configure it so that it's safe to give, so that you're not likely to be exploited. If you give, your efforts will not be wasted. Then people are looking for that opportunity, and it unlocks a kind of a loyalty and commitment that causes the group to function very well. So you truly can do well by doing good, but only with the appropriate structure. If you don't have the appropriate structure, then all kinds of exploitation can take place within groups and between groups. That's why structure is paramount. And then once again, if you consider at the group level, here are these groups that are just giving to all of their stakeholders, but with the appropriate structure. I have in mind who produces fat tar?
New Belgium
Brewing Company. By doing that, they create a supply chain around themselves that just makes them super efficient for their operation. A lot of work went into it and a lot of collaborative partnerships, but at the end of the day, then that kind of well-working supply chain is just competitive. It's just competitive. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Cooperative consortia beat disorganized consortia. So it ends up being perfectly competitive and at the same time benign. So thoughts on that, and then I. But yeah, any reflections on that?
Good, Phil. Do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Again, it's an inherent paradox if you think about it, isn't it? Between the two, and I know we've spoken about this ourselves, David, in terms of kind of pro-social world, but the distinction between, if you like, a go-to-market strategy and a go-to-community strategy, where a go-to-market strategy is having a predefined point of view on the role or the value of a product targeted at a set of individual needs, right? That's fundamentally what a go-to-market strategy actually is. Whereas a go-to-community strategy is how do you provide and facilitate an experience that people can control and have autonomy over, which can then allow them to direct the value that they extract from that experience themselves, and there provide the mechanics for that to be shared more broadly across the community. So again, it's just another way of saying the difference between these two paradigms operating at a different altitude and within a different construct, but it's fundamentally the same thing. And to your point about Fat Tire in New Belgium, and I know Paul Polman at Unilever talks about this a lot in terms of what he would call kind of pre-competitive alliances. But if you can build ecosystems of partnerships around a category need or driver where every party wins as a result of servicing or better providing a solution to that particular need, then all boats rise and everybody wins. And then the implicit rules for partnership and collaboration are baked in. It's when those needs are approached independently and from different perspectives without that unified approach that everything starts to kind of fall apart.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little comment on New Belgium, which is sort of interesting. Part of this is, they for a long time were employee owned, so that created a whole different set of sort of buy-in and decision-making structure where they were very different than many traditional companies. And I think that's another part of this B Corp movement that has been growing, is actually thinking about ownership structures. And there's employee owned, which there's a lot of examples of that. Also, Patagonia has recently introduced this, or not introduced, but introduced to its organization more of like a trustee or foundation based ownership structure. And I think when you think about the paradigm that we were talking about earlier, part of perhaps, I don't know, the bug that might be in it is this dramatic inequality that exists in ownership traditionally. So you have many companies, they get funded by venture capital or private equity organizations, and then the level of inequality that gets created, separating the management and the employees is quite severe. So that's anyways, another.
Well, I think that gets us to number 2 here: equitable distribution of benefits and
Sure.
resources. And I could well imagine, what's the income disparity in a B Corp compared to other corporations? Is the CEO making 300 times the? I doubt it. But what are some of the thinking that goes in here, so that basically everyone within the organization says, I'm getting a fair deal. I'm actually sharing the benefits of this group. I'm not being ripped off by my CEO or.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that's, so some well, first of all, some B Corps are employee owned. And that's something that, in the B impact assessments, you get pretty sizable amount of points for being employee owned, I think, for these sort of equitable benefits reasons. Also, when you look at, sort of pay disparity between highest paid and lowest paid, that's also something that is considered. And there's a number of B Corps that are very public in saying, we're maxing out at 18 to 1, or some are even 10 to 1, saying we will not have any single employee that makes 10 times more than the lowest paid employee. So, this Dr. Bronner's, which you might know of, sort of makes sort of shampoos, a variety of other, personal care products, is sort of well known. I think they're 18 to 1 actually. So they have a corporate policy that says, the top paid can't make more than 18 times the lowest paid.
Now I'm reminded that sometimes this is just the norm of business, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Norway. And when I was working in Norway with my colleagues there, I learned that in Norway, it would be regarded as just wrong if the CEO made more than some small multiple, like,
Sure.
17 times or something like that. So there you have a business culture that's kind of the norm. And so much of this depends upon norm, what's considered right or
Right.
not. So let's turn to decision making. And I think that decision making, in the first place, based on everything I know, any B Corp would be bend over backwards to make decision making fair and equitable. But we do get to scaling problems, and that when we talk about employee owned and other forms of kind of flat organizational structure, that they can have their own problems just in purely organizational terms. And structure by itself is not a bad thing. Even structure that looks hierarchical is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as there's enough bottom-up control. So decision-making turns out to be pretty complicated, trading off efficiency with equity, and especially as you become larger as an organization. So both of you speak to me a little bit about how B Corps navigate this very complex terrain of decision making.
Yeah, I mean that's within B Corp, so I might turn it over to Phil. But my experience is there's variation on this. I do think that some companies are set up in a more equitable decision-making way, whereas others, not as much. But
yeah, I mean, I can speak from our point of view. We established back in August 2018 and fortunately had just a couple of years under our belts before COVID hit, which of course had a dramatic impact in the way that decisions are made and companies are run. In early 2020, we decided to move to a completely remote model. So everyone that works for Grounded is remote. We're scattered quite literally all over the world. And try and meet up on 2 or 3 times a year as best we can. But as a result of that, decision making is decentralized decision making like that, particularly in a service-based industry, which is consultancy driven, where you're only as good as your ability to respond to clients' needs, is a real challenge. and I would say that that's probably been for us the biggest challenge we faced, is how do you empower people to own workflow and delivery? How do you empower them to feel that they have autonomy and they're able to kind of make a positive impact and difference?
Yep.
But how do you do that in a way that doesn't violate the fundamental principles of operating a commercially successful business? Which then again comes right back to the previous point about balancing purpose and profit, right? Mm-hmm. So I think what we've managed to do, or what we're able to do, is, myself and my co-founder, any decisions that are commercially driven, I think the team, automatically would say they will default to us as the fundamental kind of drivers of the business. Anything that's more to do with how impact is delivered, or how clients are serviced, or how work is generated, I think we try and make a little bit more inclusive and open and collaborative, because it's unique to each client, it's unique to each individual. And of course, often the work quality and delivery is better the more brains you have on the problem trying to solve it. So if it's used in the right way, it can actually be generative. It can actually be a way of accelerating creativity and innovation and performance, You've just got to create the right time and the right space and the right signals to the team to say, we're in this mode right now. This is the mode that we're in. This is the intention. So let's see what kind of pops out the other side. And I think my biggest learning, having come from a classical, the world of big classical advertising with big global brands, is that I've been, over my entire career, I've just been directed to, and therefore are expected to direct. And it's taken me a while from a personal evolution point of view to realize that actually that's the enemy of all things good.
Yeah,
you need to kind of create the space to allow people to actually get there themselves. And that's hard, because it kind of, it rubs up against everything that you feel and every instinct that you have sometimes, but you just have to go with it and kind of see what happens, and be there with a pair of gloves to pick up the ball if need be.
Yeah, there's an amazing example of this, and I'm not quite going to remember the name, but it's a nuclear submarine captain that actually implemented these principles. A nuclear submarine, I mean, if ever a top-down hierarchy was needed, surely it must be that. But he's a great proponent of what he calls the leader-leader model as opposed to a leader-follower model, and basically says no matter where you are in this hierarchy, if you're just taking orders, and that's a waste of resources, you have to be some kind of decision-making agent, whatever your place within this organization is, and the whole system has to be constructed around what he calls a leader-leader model, as opposed to a leader-follower model. And if that's true for a nuclear submarine, then it's got to be true for business. I'm eager to get to monitoring transparency of behavior, because there is where I think the B Corp movement is truly exceptional. And I think for the benefit of our listeners, not all of whom will be familiar, in the first place, if I understand it correctly, a B Corp has to pay a small portion of its profits into the whole system in order to get started. And then it's required to provide extensive information about itself, which turns into a kind of a scoring system by which they receive the B Corp designation, and also that provides a kind of a ladder that they can climb in order to improve by all these metrics. So it's not just something you wear on your sleeve. In fact, I was amazed, Chris, when I read your book, that to learn that many B Corps, after they get this designation, they don't even advertise it. They don't even put it on their products. That's not why they did it. So that blew me away. So there are all these outlays, but that means that, like, greenwashing is almost impossible. If you're a B Corp, you can't be accused of greenwashing because you've done all of this. Is that a fair thing to say, Chris?
So I would, that's a strong way to put it, but I would generally agree with your sentiment. I know because this is something that I think any sort of proactive discussion of how companies are, being socially responsible, immediately people have a knee-jerk reaction around greenwashing. And I think, there have been some examples of maybe B Corps that, maybe didn't live up to the ethos of the community. So I don't want to say it's impossible to greenwash, but I do think the direction of what you're saying is totally on base. And just maybe I should back up a little bit and say, so there's, I would say, I think 3 or 4 sort of key elements of becoming a B Corp. And the payment is one that's pretty far down the line really. So there is this, social, environmental assessment that occurs. It's called the B Impact Assessment. And this is a tool that, not just B Corps use, but hundreds of thousands of companies around the world use to really help understand, or benchmark, learn from other companies around best practices in management broadly. It's actually why I titled my book Better Business, because so many of the companies that I interviewed said we got into this because we believed in the social and environmental, sort of ethos, but we came out of it better businesses. And so this transparency, process of B impact assessment is foundational. And the companies do have to reach a minimum score in order to potentially be a B Corp. They have to then, if they meet that score, they go through a verification and assessment process with a sort of B Lab staff member to make sure.
So there's a third-party assessment, so you can't just make it up.
Exactly. So that's B Lab is the global nonprofit organization that sort of is involved in assessing those companies. So one aspect is this B impact assessment, scoring above a threshold, having the score verified. Another is corporate governance. So the company has to actually embed within its corporate governance. This could be through becoming a benefit corporation, which is a new type of corporation that actually puts extended purpose in sort of the legal framework, not just meeting the shareholder needs, or in some jurisdictions or in some corporate types, actually inserting language into the operating principles. So that's the second sort of aspect. Then you do have to pay it's a small percentage. I can't remember what exactly it is now of the I think it might be even revenues. I don't know if it's profits of the company, and that those are sort of the main steps. And many of both the B impact assessment and the corporate governance. I mean, these are free tools that any company can use, and hundreds of thousands of companies, use these because they think they're valuable. And I think that they're increasingly valuable, for this transparency point, with this point 4 here, because there is a lot more scrutiny on companies from a variety of different stakeholders. The government is getting more involved in having companies report on these environmental and social issues. Investors are more interested in it. Consumers and the general public are also increasingly more interested in. So I think this is I agree with you. I was actually waiting for you to come to this point too, because I do think this is an area that is a real strength of the B Corp movement.
And as you say, is extending beyond it. So anyone who aspires, has the same values as a B Corp, can actually use these tools, short of actually becoming a B Corp. And we could work in a little bit of graduated responding here. So you have to do all this stuff, and if you don't, well, there's consequences. So basically, you don't get the designation. And it doesn't have to be harsh, but it's kind of, those protections are in place, so that it's difficult to game the system. It's always possible. That's another point to make. Nothing is foolproof ever for anything. So yeah. But this stacks the deck basically in favor of complying. And so, Phil, how does this look on the inside? All these requirements and so on, and is it helpful to review all these things? And then the scoring system, how has it worked for Grounded and for other organizations that you deal with?
Yeah, as Chris will know, B Lab are going through a consultation with all B Corps at the moment to try and maybe rejig or reset the scoring system or the benchmarks for how you become a B Corp. Not to say there's anything wrong with the current system, but like any organisational movement, it's evolving. And to try and make sure that the way that companies can better evaluate themselves and provide the opportunity for more companies to, ethically and credibly join the movement, there's been a need to kind of review some of these metrics and some of these benchmarks to try and, create more of an even playing field, particularly for bigger global social enterprise level companies that are very deep and diverse and complicated.
Yeah. It's not a single organization. It is itself a multi-group organization. And how do you work with that?
Exactly. So of course, then transparency becomes incredibly hard, right? Because even the kind of operational structure of the business kind of prevents necessarily that from happening. But I think what kind of tracking with your conversation and your thought, what I love about transparency more than anything else, and for me, aside from purpose, this is probably the most important driver and quality of good business, is that without transparency, you can't continuously improve. And without continuous improvement, you can't get better and evolve. It's kind of that simple. So
Yeah.
what's right at the heart of the B Corp movement, and I'd love your perspective on this as well, David, being an evolutionary biologist, is that continuous improvement is really the core principle, the heart of the B Corp movement. And it's about saying, we met a minimum requirement to be acknowledged as a business that operates perhaps in a different or slightly better way than most businesses. But you know what? We're far from perfect. The chances of us ever being perfect are very, very slim. But we're going to keep doing our very level best to keep improving against.
Well, thank you for that, Phil. Because when I present this, and in this talk, I began by saying there's two things needed: governance and adaptability. Often governance takes center stage, but adaptability is so important. And of course, we use words like "we're evolving" all the time. But I think what's remarkable about the B Corp movement is that it's good at evolving. It's deliberative about evolving. And in order to do that, you must monitor, exactly as you say. What you must do is have systemic pro-social goals. So there's something you're working towards. You need to orient variation around that. Try stuff out that's oriented towards the goal. And then you must identify and replicate best practices, realizing that they're sensitive to context. And because it's a complex world, you must do that again and again and again. And the faster the generation time of that variation, selection, replication cycle, the better it will be. And it must take place at multiple scales. It's something that a single group needs to do for itself, and it's something that the whole movement needs to do for itself. And what I find from reading your book, Chris, and other things I know about B Corp, the movement is very good at that. Very good at that. So maybe you could speak to how it engages in what, in my vocabulary, is a process of conscious cultural evolution.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you asked the sort of the people from the inside, they may not realize that they're sort of adapting so quickly. To be honest, I mean, it's really hard when you're sort of in the middle of it. But reflecting on your comment, I really actually do very much agree myself, and just it made me reflect a bit back to when I first started studying this in 2009. There were less than 300 B Corps. And my students, when I was teaching on it, would say things like, oh, this might be good for like a company like Patagonia, but it would never be good for a company that had large and diverse investors. Or, oh, this might be good for small 3-person startup, but it would never be good for sort of large multinational company. And there have been adaptations over the years to try to get at, like, actually, how can we still be authentic in this, principle one, of the identity and mission, but also extend the reach to these broader sets of constituencies. And I think, Phil mentioned that, the B Lab, the certifying body, is now undergoing sort of new types of assessment, or sort of some new principles underlying its assessment, to try to be able to sort of extend it further and deepen the movement. And I think that, this is, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's anything like it's very conscious that we are, like, the group is really trying to be, sort of adaptable. I think the world is changing. More and more companies are coming on, and, it's responding to those sort of real life happenstance as opposed to saying, have designed this very adaptable type of entity.
Well, isn't it? Don't I remember from your book that basically the whole scoring system is evaluated and revised and has been revised? Isn't it several iterations into it? And
very much so. Yeah,
that's what I was driving at.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So and this is something that I think is maybe not as well recognized, but is really, really important. So they're currently it's on version 6 of the standards, and the version that Phil mentioned is potentially is version 7. And this idea of
so version 7. Let me just bookmark
sure.
that. You said it began in 2008, right?
Yeah, 2006.
Began 2006. Yeah. So that makes it 18 years old, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it's gone through 7 versions. So it's gone through 7 generations in 18 years.
Right.
That's pretty darn good.
Yes.
That's a fast generation time.
Right. And I think the reason why it's so important is that having measurement, transparency on companies' social and environmental and community and governance factors. I mean, this is actually relatively new terrain. This is not like people, compare this maybe to financial metrics for firms. I mean, there's been hundreds of years where there was like all kinds of experimentation, and, we've now sort of coalesced on these ideas. There's a paradigm around, revenue, profit, return on equity, return on assets, stock, price. But those actually came about through a process like not unlike B-Lab has been going through an accelerated way. The previous thing was for, a variety of accountants, basically in accounting standards boards, determining how to actually assess companies' financial processes. So there's been a tremendous amount of learning and application. And many companies have told me, I'm not sure how many times you've been through the assessment, Phil, but it gets harder every time. And the reason why it gets harder is because the sort of knowledge and understanding of actually how to measure what B-Lab is intending to measure, is more, it gets more sort of detailed and rigorous over time, and it gets much more to actually understanding what the sort of eventual impacts on the world are, as opposed to just some sort of input from the company. And so I think that this process of continuous, sort of multiple iterations of standards is a very important part of that. So thank you for flagging that.
Yeah.
And you have to recertify every 3 years currently. So that adaptability is built in, David. You as a company, you have to go through the recertification every 3 years. Track how you'll track yourself against the metrics, the benchmarks that you met last time, with the view to obviously kind of improving your score against some of those key impact pillars as you move forward. So
what's the retention rate? I mean, how many B Corps companies become B Corps for a while and then drop out?
Yeah, I actually don't know what the I actually don't know what the leaky bucket rate is. I do get a little bit of a sense, and I'm sure B-Lab would probably have this data. I do get a little bit of a sense that as the movement's growing, it's becoming more of a challenge, actually, to keep B Corps within the community. Again, going back to that fundamental challenge between purpose and profit, is that often, companies are attracted to the B Corp community because, it feels like the right thing to do. But there's a difference between the right thing to do and doing the right things, right? Yeah. As we often say to our clients as well. And doing the right things is really hard, particularly when you're trying to kind of survive as a business. So, yeah.
Well, just demographically, we know that you said there are 8,000, Chris, and so I mean, if you looked at just the growth rate, it would look like an exponential curve, wouldn't it? I mean,
yeah, very, very much. And I think it's COVID. Actually, there was a doubling approximately during COVID. So I think that for whatever maybe people or businesses said, we need to actually think about how do we are treating our workers and the environment better, or also maybe it freed up time for people to actually, it was something that was on the list of things to do for a while, and it's an intensive process. So yeah, so very much an exponential type of curve. And there are B Corps that leave, and I think that this version 7, which is a pretty dramatic rethinking of how the scoring works, might result in some sort of people, sort of unfortunately leaving the community as well. I had a PhD student actually that studied the sort of B Corp, the companies that left, sort of former B Corps. And the main time that happened was when the benefit corporation law came into being. So that legal form of companies, what maybe around 2014 or so, or maybe it must have been earlier than that, maybe 2010, but Delaware in the U.S. was 2014. And so what happened is that companies were required to become a benefit corporation if they were to maintain their B Corp status, and some did not want to do that. So that ended up resulting in some leaving. So
well, I'd like to make a comparison. I study religion in addition to business, and when we turn to religions, what we find is that there's a continuum from what we often call strict and lax, or strong and weak. So a really strong religion just places so many demands on its members, but of course they get a lot for it too. And then there's other religious congregations that are less demanding, and that's a better choice for some people. So I can well imagine that some business would say, well, I haven't given up on my principles here.
Right.
But the fact is that I think that I can do this another way with a little bit less structure. And it actually raises a point that I'm going to be having the same conversation with leaders of the conscious capitalism movement, Raj Sisodia and Bob Chapman, who's the CEO of Barry Wehmiller, which is an amazing, amazing company, also has a high profile based on their book, Everybody Matters. But when you look at the conscious capitalism movement, you find, I would say, the same ethos, but a lot less structure, and a lot less coordination among the companies. And in some ways, I think that's credit to the B Corp movement for having so much more structure with transparency, for example, but also a little bit constraining. And that if you don't have that particular structure, there's some sense in which you might have more elbow room to actually pursue the same vision. And do you have thoughts on that? Either one of you have thoughts on like comparing the conscious capitalism movement with the B Corp movement?
Yeah, I think that, I would concur with you, with that, what you said. I would also say, though, that a great thing is that there's a lot of overlap between conscious capitalism and the B Corp movement. For instance, for this new book that I'm doing, I'm going to a bunch of cities around the U.S. to give talks. Many of the events are co-hosted by the local B Corp organization and the local conscious capitalism chapter.
It's happening in Connecticut.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So it's or for instance, San Diego is an example of a place where I'm going, and there's the conscious capitalism may also, sort of co-organize the session that's going to be, but then also I'm in contact with with the conscious capitalism group about a separate meetup with some of their members to talk about actually these ideas in the education context, because they're very involved with professors in San Diego. But actually, a number of the conscious capitalism council that I'm engaging with are actually B Corps themselves. And so, I do think that these are the sort of, I don't know, fellow travelers, but
it's a larger
with different,
tribe. And the B Corp movement,
right.
this came through in your book, Chris. That's the way they want it. I mean, they don't want everyone to become a B Corp. They really don't. They want to make their tools available to companies
Right.
that'll never become a B Corp. They want and so on. So I really get that, and it does have to be diverse in that way. Maybe this is a good opportunity for you to describe your new book, Chris, a little bit as how it fits into this big picture that we've been painting.
Sure. I don't know if Phil had any comments on this last point or not.
Only just to echo exactly what you said, and I was recently invited to join the board of Be Local Connecticut, actually. And Chris, I know you're visiting us. I think it's in May, isn't it?
I think it's June 6th, I believe.
June 6th, is it? Thank you.
Yeah.
But as kind of part of that, the mandate that we
6th.
set ourselves as a community is to proactively engage with other conscious business networks and communities to aggregate our collective power to influence policy change actually to state level. And we actually have a kind of we're going to the Connecticut State Assembly next week. To go and collectively lobby for a green bill that's kind of hopefully going to pass through the state legislature to help support, a greener way of doing business here in Connecticut. And the only way we could do that is by uniting forces with conscious capitalism and the Sustainable Business Development Council locally and bringing everyone together around that common objective. So it's very much part of I think the B Corp mentality and speaks directly to the core design principle 8, I think, in terms of making sure that we're reaching the consequences of our right.
And I think another way to put it, which speaks to the generality of the principles, not just business groups but all groups, when B Corps make good on their commitment to the community, that means that they're going to be dealing with all kinds of groups that aren't businesses, schools, neighborhoods, you name it. And to be able to think about those groups, the organizations of those groups, not even businesses, as needing the same basic principles just speaks to the advantages of thinking this generally about what do all groups need? What do all groups need? They need to be well governed and they need to be adaptable. That's the common denominator. To be able to teach that or to convey that to all groups, I think is amazing and what's possible with this new paradigm. Now your new book.
Sure. Yeah. And I even have a copy of it right here. Sort of for the listeners or the viewers, I should say, if people watch this via video. Yeah. So it's people have said to me, so the previous book on B Corps was called Better Business. This book is called The Profiteers. How could the same person be writing these books that sound very, very different, but actually I think they have very common roots and have a very common mission. And I think that overall, the work that I do now for 20 years on sustainable business is really how business can be a powerful engine and force for good in the world through social impact, through environmental impact. And the book Better Business, was situated in many ways against this, standard neoclassical paradigm that you described. But that was just a very small part of the book. And this book, Profiteers, in some ways is a bit more of a prequel to the Better Business book, in that it digs into, the issues that are created when businesses are just focused on maximizing profit. And in particular, the externalities, so the social and environmental costs that get borne by society, and businesses have developed all kinds of, very tricky communications, PR, and lobbying efforts to really, push a lot of externalities onto the general public. And so that's sort of one area of focus of the book. And the publisher really wanted to focus on that sort of area in the title because it's, more provocative and maybe sort of grab some more, people might be more likely to buy it than something called Better Business. because happy stories don't sell nearly as well as as negative ones. Sadly, that's the case. I understand. But the second part of the book is in many ways a sequel to Better Business and updates a lot of the thinking that I had in Better Business and how the B Corp community has really deepened its influence in society and new business models. So it talks a lot about new ideas around regenerative business, which I see as very much like positive externalities. So the negative side that I focus on is the negative externalities, and then thinking how business can be creating positive externalities. And a lot of this came about from after publishing Better Business. I've had the opportunity to talk to hundreds of B Corp leaders, and many of them tell me about the innovations in their environmental practice or their hiring practices. And so that's a big part of the book too, is not just sort of naming and shaming companies for doing bad things, but actually highlighting the innovations and pioneers that are hopefully going to be helping reset the economic model that we have.
Yeah, so that's great. I've been reading an advanced copy. Thanks for making it available.
Oh, no worries.
Of it and loving it. But I get an impression that I wanted especially to check with you,
Sure.
which is that it's so easy to name and shame and basically draw the conclusion that these businesses that are engaging in really bad practices, egregious practices, are just selfish agents that are out for themselves and so on and so forth. And I think that's to a large extent true, but also it seems to me that in some ways these are not bad people, but normal people suffering under a bad paradigm. And there's a quote, so they think they're doing the right thing based on the way they see the world. And there's a quote that I love. I actually used it as the frontispiece for my book, This View of Life. It's by Albert Camus from his novel The Plague. And the quote is, "The evil in the world comes almost always from ignorance, and goodwill can cause as much damage as ill will if it is not enlightened. There is no true goodness or fine love without the greatest possible degree of clear-sightedness." And so I wonder your opinion as to how much this terrible situation we're in is to some degree it's just greed. I mean, greed is good. It's just as you describe it. But to some extent, is it good people or normal people suffering, not being clear-sighted enough? I just wonder.
I do think that it's. I do think it's much more of a system issue as opposed to a individual issue, without a doubt. Of course, I'm biased. My PhD is in sociology, so I'm going to, of course, think it's the, external environment that is driving things. But I think the theme of our conversation has been around, the sort of paradigms and how they shape sort of thought and action. And I pretty strongly feel, and I think a big reason why I wrote the book is to try to understand how system change may be possible. And to do that, you need a really good diagnosis of what the sort of maladies of the existing way of doing things is. And so I'm with you, 100% that it's, I'm sure there's, uber self-interested actors and there's greed. I'm not saying there's not, but I think that the bigger issue is that, the sort of, the system, and by the system, I mean the laws that exist, the incentives from investors and capital markets, the cultural expectations on business. And so I do think those are the areas where it's important to think about changing.
That's great. That's a good way to finish up. So Phil, do you want to add a final reflection on that? I'm happy with the way this conversation is unfolded.
No, that's great. For me, it's it's interesting to watch the pendulum swing between intention and action. And I like to kind of view the world as how do you navigate these two polarities? And most organisations are geared and structured to act, and the agents within them are incentivised to act. And the feedback mechanisms they get and the loops that they benefit from are based on their ability to act, right? And they devolve intention further up the hierarchy, or perhaps in some cases not at all. So I think kind of what we're saying is, the general business community is starting to, the pendulum is swinging away, from action back towards intention again. It'll be interesting to see kind of how that translates, and how setting the intention, ownership of intention, and how that intention can be more transparently executed across an organisation, I think is really kind of where the essence of all this is really going. And if we can figure how to bridge the intention action gap in all the spaces and places where it truly matters, of which I think kind of pro-sociality is of course a key pathway for doing so, then we'll be in a much better place overall.
Yeah, it goes without saying that that's going to be an iterative process. So and I think from by my lights, the more we can see that as a conscious process of multi-level cultural evolution, then the better we'll get at actually doing it. It's what we're doing. I've have so many conversations which show that practice forces people and organizations into the zone of experimentation. So anything that works and is experience driven rather than theory driven pushes you into this zone of conscious cultural evolution. We have goals. We try stuff out. We replicate what sticks, and we repeat it. But to be more deliberative and explicit, and to have actually the theory built around that, as opposed to the theory being over here and the practice being over here, is what's, I think, going to make it go a lot better. And so this has been a great contribution to that. And so I thank you both for your time and your thoughts.
Pleasure.
Great. No, thank you, David. And great to be part of this with you, Phil.